Okay. All right. Welcome everybody to the second meeting of Sensory Motor AI Journal Club. Um, Today we're going to discuss this paper, a unifying framework for generalized Bayesian online learning in non-stationary environments by Duran-Martin and colleagues. And we are very lucky that Gerardo or Jerry agreed to join us and present the paper himself. So last month we covered Bayesian online natural gradients or BONG, and today we're gonna cover Bayesian online learning in non-stationary environments or BONE. And we're excited about BONE because it has a very interesting, it takes a very interesting approach to learning. First of all, it's online learning. It deviates from this artificial paradigm of train test split that we see in most of machine learning. And it's also about a non-stationary environment, which is the real world. So that's why we're really excited. And also, it's a unifying framework. So it's theoretically very rich. But before diving into BONE, let me just give you the outline. So we have this RL debate series planned for the next few meetings. I'm going to just introduce and motivate that for maybe hopefully like not too long, probably like 10 minutes. Then we're going to hand it over to Gerardo to present BONE, and then finally we're going to have a Q&A. And this section, like last time, is not going to be recorded. So if you have any hot takes or questions you want to discuss without being recorded, keep it for that part. But of course, we are encouraging all sorts of discussions and interruptions during the meeting as well. All right, so this is just a punchline before motivating. We're going to just have these three brave contenders to defend a different position and different approaches to reinforcement learning. I'm not going to go into details of their positions now, but this is just the kind of the punchy one-liner. So Adam is going to defend the mainstream value function, reward, Q function approach. Eli is going to make a case for active inference, and Tom is going to tell us about empowerment and his new framework that he invented, and which is not, it doesn't depend on rewards. So like a new paradigm. And finally, we're going to have a debate session. Hopefully, there's some good sparring. And then we're going to end up with a synthesis and a kind of conclusion to just integrate over what we learned from these different approaches. But what really motivates us to do this debate is, first of all, we've read the paper, Welcome to the Era of Experience by Sutton and Silver. So we're jumping on that hype train. There's another reason. That's not the only reason. So the question is, why do we have brains? What are brains for? And to answer this, we're going to turn to our good old friend, Charles Darwin. From an evolutionary perspective, brains are for survival and reproduction. And neither of these is possible without some action. So that's like puts action as a central stage. And if you zoom out and look at all animals move, even the ones that don't see, even bacteria, E. coli, they move. So this motivates our question. How can we understand agency and behavior? This is like a scientific question. Like this is probably one of the main questions of neuroscience. How can we understand how brain gives rise to behavior? And we also have this engineering question. How can we build agents that act in the world in the way we want them to? So these two questions motivate understanding the origin and source of behavior. So where do actions come from? What theoretical framework do we have to understand actions? The mainstream view is reinforcement learning, where people argue that agents act to maximize rewards. And this can be best seen in this figure from the standard textbook in this field. So there's an agent that produces an action at time t called A sub t. And the environment,
Hadi,
yeah.
you should possibly share your screen so we can see the
Oh
figure.
no.
Right, next time you should say something.
Yeah, maybe I should start again. Okay. All right, so this is for those of you. Can you guys see it now?
Yeah.
So I just said that we're going to introduce this RL debate series, and these are the contenders. They are going to defend different approaches to RL. And Should I actually just go ahead and say everything I said? Speed run. So there's like this value function, Q function, reward. That's the kind of the mainstream approach that Adam is going to defend. Eli is going to present this alternative view of active inference, and Tom has invented his own approach to RL that doesn't depend on rewards, and it's building on this notion of empowerment. And then finally, we're going to have some debate and synthesis we're going to combine insights from these different views. All right, so let's motivate what our brains for. I just mentioned this, so I'm just going to just show you the slide. We are recognizing that action is central to understanding agency and intelligence in broadly. And we have two intertwined but related goals of scientific understanding of agency and where behavior comes from. That's like a neuroscience question. And we also want to have this like engineering motivation.
Excuse me, Hadi. Just need
Yeah.
to pick on you a little bit here.
Okay. Go ahead.
Not all animals actually move.
All right. Give me an
All
example.
animals with brains move.
Um, I don't know if
There are
about
animals
that.
without brains that are basically not actively motile under their own power.
So what about bacteria? They move around a little bit, don't they? Don't they?
I mean, yeah, but they're not animals and they don't have brains, so they're out of scope.
I mean, there's like barnacles, they just kind of stick themselves somewhere and then they're only
How do they stick themselves if they don't move?
they literally just have created a protein that binds to anything basically. And then they float around until they get stuck and then their action space is open mouth, not open mouth.
Well, that's still some action, it's just it's a very limited action space. So I don't know. I'll think about this. Is it all animals or almost all animals? But I thought that it's all animals that move.
So I don't know if this is apocryphal, but Daniel Wolford used to always tell this story of the sea squirt that
Yeah.
that central nervous system moves around and then at some point plankton decides to never move again
Yeah.
and digest its central nervous.
So at that point, yeah, even the brain is not important. Like it was just used for
Yes, exactly. That's
Yeah.
why it's important to get the biology right, is that it sort of
Yeah.
reinforces the theory here.
Okay.
If you're not going to move, you can just digest your own brain. But if you're going to move, you're going to need a brain.
Exactly. I'm not sure like what constitutes a brain, but a nervous system, yes, for sure. But I guess we agree with the conclusion that action is central, and we have been ignoring it. I have been ignoring it in my own work, and I guess the field broadly also. So I guess that's motivates us to understand action and put it in our models, which is the motivation for this debate. And the mainstream view is that agents act to maximize reward. That's what reinforcement learning tells us. And this is summarized in this figure from Sutton and Bartow's textbook. There's an agent that produces an action A sub t, and then the environment receives that action, updates the state to st sub plus 1. And then there's this reward thing that the environment produces and gives to the agent. But there are some issues with this view. What are the challenges? First of all, reward is inferred, not given. Different animals, different people infer different amounts of rewards from the same sensory evidence. Like, for example, if you imagine two people that are hungry, and one of them is an omnivore and the other is vegan. If you have two food items like a burger and a salad, they're going to assign they're going to get different amounts of rewards from those different food items. So it's this, I want to emphasize the subjective nature of rewards. Also, if you think about complex naturalistic behaviors, it's not entirely clear what is the reward function there. It's like this one scalar thing that how can complex behavior emerge from optimizing for this single scalar? And if you think about this, in both neuroscience experiments, we kind of narrow our scope down to very, very limited, reduced experimental paradigms where there's like a very simple reward function and simple behaviors that allows us to study reward processing in these like simplified unnaturalistic settings. And in machine learning, most of these algorithms in RL that have worked, they've worked on these Atari games where there's this dense reward signal that is kind of like gives structure to the agent. And we haven't yet seen RL work in real world settings. So that's another challenge. The last challenge is not all active learning is reinforcement learning. I guess this action-centric view encourages us to think about active learning. But I'm going to argue using this very famous experiment from Tolman that active learning is a bigger space than reinforcement learning. And of course, I'm talking about this paper and a series of experiments that Tolman did in 30s and 40s, which led him to introduce this theoretical concept of cognitive maps to explain his experimental results, which are as follows. So they put some rats in a maze and they allowed these rats to navigate and just hang out at the maze. And they had these they divided these rats into different experimental groups. The first group were rewarded with food when they reached the end of the maze. Here, there's a food box. And there was a second group that food never existed. They never received any reinforcing signal of a reward. And then the delayed group, they didn't receive any rewards during the first half of the experiment, but then food was introduced in the second half of the experiment. Like the experiment took maybe like 17 days. The first 10 days, this delayed group didn't receive any rewards, and they received rewards after the first 10 days. And this is the most interesting experimental group. And just looking at the results, we see that, first of all, x-axis here is trials, 1 trial per day. Y-axis is average error. I don't know why the font is like so weird, but I took it from this link. So the average error, you want to reduce this because the error is like the rats, if they could find the food item, that constitutes like a hit trial, and if they couldn't, that's error. So what is interesting here is that, first of all, the rewarded group, the green group, they started learning about reducing their error as time went by in a steady pace, but they started to saturate around this value, like error rate of 3. And the no reward group, they didn't learn any structure because, of course, there was no structure to be learned about the food specifically. And the most interesting group, the delay reward group, they didn't learn at first, just like the orange group. But once the food was introduced, the actual reward was introduced, they learned the structure much more quickly than this green group. And also they outperformed them. They actually reduced, they have like this reduced amount of error. So this is very interesting, like, why they're doing better than these rewarded groups. It's almost as if like they were just learning a cognitive map of the maze. They were just internalizing, they were absorbing the structure while there was no reward. And then once the reward was introduced, they kind of use that knowledge about their world to do better than the other group. And this almost looks like a validation curve you would see in a NeurIPS paper. Like there's like the pre-training phase and then like fine-tuning phase. This would totally get into NeurIPS. Okay, so what this shows, yeah.
Maybe you were just going to say this, but I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting because, it's not a way it's most likely giving the reward, the green curve
Yeah,
blocks your ability to.
it seems to.
assimilate the cognitive, right?
Exactly.
That sort of interferes in a way.
Yeah,
Because maybe you see the animal learns to become more associative
yeah.
than sort of getting the big picture.
The getting picked. Yeah, so I guess the gap here.
But it's very cool. That's definitely.
What is the so the error is still going down even for the no reward. Oh, getting out was a small reward. Okay, that's
What do you mean, like the orange one?
yeah, I was just curious that basically even when there wasn't like a significant reward, they were still getting better, which is
Yeah,
because that's not a given that they would be interested in minimizing error even if there's nothing in it for them in books.
I wonder.
Getting out was a small reward.
Yeah, so that's why I had noticed some stuff.
Yeah, I
That's
guess.
still interesting.
So one thing I'm not sure about, just I should mention, is that this curve, I'm not sure if it's exactly from the paper or it's just a schematic from this link. That's one thing to check. But yeah, there's a small reward for they're just picking them up when they reach the end. There's no food, but there's some small reward for just completing this task. Like they're picked out of the maze. So maybe that explains it.
Lee, could I ask a quick question?
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, just two things. One, what does the y-axis actually say? It looks like the text
Yeah, it says average errors.
Which is average error. Okay. And then just to make sure I understand, so on day 10, they just place a reward in the maze somewhere. And then like the mice figure it out really quickly.
Exactly. For the blue delayed reward group, yes. This suggests that they've internalized, they have this like eternal model of this maze, and then once the reward is placed there, they can use that knowledge in service of this, maximizing the reward. So
Is it just like an exploration versus exploitation thing? Like, what do you think is or I haven't read the paper, but
I think
did they
the way Tolman himself phrases this, so let's think about the context in which this paper was published. This is like 30s, right? Back then, behaviorism was a dominant view. They just didn't care about what's going on inside the brain. They had this like paradigm of the brain is just stimulus response mapping black box, and it always either finds associations between stimuli that are rewarding and increases those, and then reduces like gets rid of the associations that lead to negative rewards or punishment or something. And in that view, there's no learning other than reinforcement learning. There has to be some reward to make you learn. And Tolman claims that no, it's not the case. In the case of delayed reward, it appears like they learned something that distinguishes them from the green curve. And what is that? He calls it latent learning, which is different from latent variables. It's just kind of sounds like unsupervised learning. But this paper, the point of this paper is that not all learning is reinforcement learning. That's one major message. Yes.
Uh, I,
Yeah.
and I also had one question. In terms of trials, is there some variability, like where the rat is dropped in the maze? Is it different in every trial, or like is it the same thing it's doing every day?
I don't know for sure, but this figure seems to suggest it's not. So there's a start
Okay.
point and there's a food box, and the door and curtain probably like prevent the rats from going to the food box, like let's say like maybe for delayed reward. I don't know the details, but
Okay.
probably there's always a structure.
Honey, I'm also
Okay.
go into this a lot more in detail during the RL debates.
Yes. So the point here, exactly. I want to just move ahead because we don't want to take away from the actual presentation. The point here is that not all active learning is reinforcement because these rats were actively, engaged in this navigation. And here's just one. This is a paper, actually a funny paper to read. So Tolman calls, he was from Berkeley and calls graduate students underpaid research assistants who supposedly got some of their ideas from me. So it's a very fun read if you're gonna go check it out. It's actually not that hard.
I linked it in the thing. It doesn't figure is a schematic. He has more detail.
Of course,
more
yeah.
messy.
Yeah, it's always more messy in the actual lecture. All right, so let's just go quickly try to interpret this result. Okay, this suggests reward is not enough to understand all behavior. We need to upgrade or replace RL with a framework that's not solely reward based. Because what is the reward in that navigation? Like they certainly learn something without the presence of an explicit reward. And the other interpretation is that maybe there's some sort of intrinsic reward, like a curiosity reward or something like that. But this is also problematic because in this figure from Sutton and Bartow, we have this reward that is provided to the agent from the environment. And if you call it intrinsic reward, that just doesn't add up, right? So I guess this motivates our debate. And then going back to our brave contenders, we're going to have different people present different approaches to RL. Adam is going to defend the mainstream approach of reward or value maximization, and Eli and Tom are going to present some alternative views. And hopefully we're going to have some debate. So yeah, this is the last slide on my side. If you have any feedback, questions, let us know. And yeah, very excited to get into this. All right. That's it. I'm done. And with that, Jerry, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, sure. Very looking forward to the debate.
Thank you. Okay, so I don't know if you can share.
Yeah, I think I have to let me try. Let's see. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. This looks like a really interesting journal club. completely different from what I do, but hopefully, we cross-pollinate some really interesting ideas here. So today I wanted to discuss about this paper that I co-wrote with my supervisors, Alex Shustopalov, Kevin Murphy, and my co-author, Leandro, also from Oxford. And really the idea behind this paper is to say, okay, how can we create agents that continually learn and adapt to their environment? Now, I think Hadi was showing this figure of the RL, this very famous figure from Sutton, and you have this reward, and then you magically get updated, right? But how do you get updated is the thing that we are interested in. And specifically, we're interested in updating it in an online way. And also adaptive. So for that, we require at least two things. The first one is that we want to continually learn from a set of streaming data sets, whatever that is. It could be internal reward, external reward. You just give me something that you want to update and it's given to you in a stream. And the second one is that you want to adapt to the data generating process. So if the streaming data set changes, you want to adapt to that and you want to make sense of that. So in this paper, what we do is we present a Bayesian perspective to tackle these two challenges. And the punchline will be that really you can think of Bayes' rule as typically introduced as a way to measure uncertainty, but another way to look at it is just simply as a way to update beliefs. If you believe this, then we can build on top of the Bayesian literature and use the use of hierarchical state space models to not only put there some parameters that we want to infer, but also some other values or variables that we want to infer on how the world is changing. And I'll get to that in a little bit. So the motivation behind this paper is that there really has been a surge of methods in machine learning that really try to tackle this problem of non-stationarity under different settings. So we can find them in contextual bandits, we can find it in test-time adaptation, in reinforcement learning, most recently in online continuous learning, where people study this problem of catastrophic forgetting or the plasticity stability trade-off. There's also found in dataset shift, where people talk about what it means to have like covariance shift, prior probability shift, domain shift, etc. Anyway, so there's like a huge, so machine learning is big, but all these subfields are big as well, and then they all try to tackle non-stationarity, whatever it means for them in different ways. And among each of these subsets, there's like a subset of the subset of each of these methods that really try to tackle this adaptation to non-stationary environments from a Bayesian point of view. However, they seem all over the place. There's not really a coherent way to compare two methods. There's also hasn't been enough recognition, I believe, from the machine learning literature to other methods that also seek to tackle non-stationarity. We can find this in the signal processing literature or the statistic literature with things like change point detection or filtering. So the goal is to propose a unifying framework that unifies these methods from a Bayesian perspective. And so that we can, as one reviewer put it, have like this way of think of how do we build adaptive models in a Lego-like way, right? You want to have different components, you want to put those components together, and then out comes a model. And then you can compare those models, you can analyze them, run experiments on them in a more systematic way. And by doing this, well, we can categorize the various methods that tackle non-stationarity under a common language. And as I said, this can include methods from the machine learning literature, but also from the statistics literature, for instance, in segmentation and switching state space models, or the engineering literature, where non-stationarity, even if it's not called that way, can be found in system identification or filtering. It also allows us to create a library. In this case, we decided to go for JAX. And it also allows us to develop, expand the scope of the methods that have been developed, right? We can take a method from the statistics literature created for segmentation, we can apply it for online continuous learning. And that's an example that we'll see in a little bit. Of course, it also allows us to develop new methods. So that's the purpose of this framework, really, to do all these things. And as we'll see, it really it boils down to, if you believe in this Bayesian way to build agents, then it's really you can think of this as perform an inference in this hierarchical state space model, where you have to pick different pieces of the puzzle. And then once you pick those pieces, then you have to decide how you want to do inference. And once you do that inference, then you have your new algorithm. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk through the setup, the more mathematical details of the paper, and then I'm going to introduce each of the ingredients that we require to develop one of these non-stationarity Bayesian methods. And yeah, then we're going to create some new methods, and then we're going to benchmark them to see how well they behave. Of course, any questions, feel free to ask. And,
so I have a question about this graphical
Yes.
model. Were you going to like introduce each individual component at some point, or is it coming?
Yes, yes. The point is to go like step by step to build towards this hierarchical state space model. So we'll start with the basics. We'll start with the very basics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks
Sounds
for
good.
that question. And we're gonna start with in fact, we're gonna start with this node over here. These two nodes, right? So this is a hierarchical state space model. This means that we're observing these two variables. And in the online or incremental or streaming or sequential learning, the idea is we'll have this sequence of data points, being my context in bandits or my features or my state and some observation or some reward. And the idea is in this online setting, as I start to observe more and more data points, which are time ordered, all I want to do is, given the past sequence of data points, which I'm going to denote here as these dark boxes, I want to predict what's going to happen in the next time step, right? So that's a fairly simple setup.
I have a question about the generality of this. So you have a data set of X and Y per time point, and it seems like it's supervised. So you have some X like an image and Y is a label. You want to predict Y from X. But I guess you can just drop Y and turn this into an unsupervised setting where you have just some observation X, right? Would that work as well in your framework?
Yep. Yeah, you can definitely do that. Yeah, the idea is that, as you said, right, the main point is that you have these data points here that arrive in you at every time step. We did it for the, in this case, a supervised setting, but it doesn't have to be the case, right? At the end of the day, it's really how you're going to update your beliefs, given this new data point, however you want to model it. So yeah, thank you for that comment. The goal in that case, it shouldn't be to estimate y t+1. It could be like, generate a new image or a new frame of the video, however you want to measure that. But for now, I'll keep it with this supervised setting. And the first things we need is, so the setting is I want to predict what's the next frame or what's the next value in the sequence or what's the next token, whatever that is. If you want to follow a Bayesian online learning procedure, we need two things. And the first one is, how do I choose a model, right? And by that, I mean, we're going to consider a parametric model, and it's going to be parameterized by some parameters theta here. And I'm going to consider a probabilistic model of the observations y. So that's why I consider this y and x here. So had in your example, instead of, we would swap out this, so we would have only a parametric model of x, for instance.
Sounds good.
But anyways, so in this setting, we have a probabilistic model for the observations. And we assume that the observation model, this probabilistic observation model, has some conditional expectation y given theta and x given by some function h. And this function is whatever you like, right? So that's the first thing we want to do. You can port something from scikit-learn if you want to. You can do something as simple as a linear regression. In this case, theta and x is simply a linear regression. You can do a logistic regression if we're doing classification. You can choose a neural network if you want to, or you can just pick whatever neural architecture you want, right? So that's a separate thing. Which H is the best? That's entirely up to the scientist to decide. For now, we're going to give it as given. All we're going to assume for now is that this expectation over y given theta and x is given by this function h. And whenever you see h, think about your favorite neural network architecture. And then, so now we have this probabilistic model, and then we're going to try to do Bayesian inference, right? Because we're trying to follow a Bayesian procedure. So by the way, this is the first component. This is going to be the M1, which is going to be the first part of our hierarchical state space model. And now that I have my probabilistic observation model, then if I'm being Bayesian, because I'm parameterizing by theta, have some beliefs about what the value of theta is, right? At least as in principle. So you have some prior that could be well specified or misspecified, and you have some data set 1 to t. And from Bayes' rule, we know that, well, if I want to do Bayesian inference, really, I want to find the posterior density over theta, given my data set t, right? And we know that if the observations are condition dependent given thetas and x, then it can be factorized this way, right? And that's a classical way to look at Bayes. And typically, this is presented to then induce some sort of uncertainty, which is important, but it's not the main point here in the paper. In the paper, we really want to use Bayes' rule as a recursive way of propagating information forward. So instead of thinking it as just having a prior times the likelihood, which is typically written as this, we can believe that if for some reason we have some prior that is given to us, it can be sample-based or it can be some function of the theta that takes this form. If this is our prior, then the posterior is simply going to be the prior at time t is going to be the previous posterior at time t, right? And the only likelihood is the only observation that I have here. Now, this formulation doesn't mean that it has to be per time step. You can also consider a batch sense where you can make like 10 predictions, and you make all those 10 predictions, you evaluate it, and then your data set now has like each batches of 10. But this is our main, this is the main point that we care about in this formulation. How do you make recursive Bayesian updates, which in a way is like resembles what you saw in Bong, I think last time.
And I would add that probably like, I know you were motivated from just a machine learning perspective, probably, but to me, this sounds also more, if you believe that the brain is doing Bayesian inference, this recursive online approach is more realistic in that sense, that you always have this at any time point and you receive stimuli or whatever data in a streaming way. So you get to update only for like per data point rather than in a batch sense. But yeah, just wanted to add that it's like it's also biologically motivated.
No, that's great, because sometimes I need a reference because some of the referees are like, well, what do you care about this? So yeah, you send me those references, Hadi.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But okay, so
sorry, there's a question. So maybe I can repeat it. What is your question?
So we're going to get back to that graphical model, but I'm unclear here where the state space has gone, right? Is it in theta, or is this theta where the parameters of your favorite neural network? That's like a deterministic function given the samples. Where is the like statefulness that was introduced early on?
Did you hear the question?
Yes, so there's still no, I think the question is, where is the state space model in this representation? There's not yet a state space model, and that's because theta are fixed. So this is just a classical graphical model where you have like a theta that propagates all of the data points. So I'm starting with the fact that I just want to build Bayesian inference without any state space model for now. This is the
perfect. Cool.
Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep, great. Okay, so we have static Bayes, we have recursive Bayes, but of course, for recursive Bayes to work, you have to believe that really the data generating process has to come from this likelihood model, which if you use in a neural network, is very likely that it's not the case. You're not really using your, I don't know, your CNN or your Mamba or your transformer because you truly believe that the data generating process comes from a normal, right? It's just typically just out of convenience. So there's this field in Bayesian statistics that's being pushed by many people, brilliant people at UCL, that really we can, instead of talking about recursive Bayes, we can talk about instead generalized Bayes. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the generalized recursive Bayes, where instead of thinking of a likelihood, I'm going to think of a loss function. And I'm going to think of a loss function because Bayes becomes a bit finicky whenever things are misspecified. And if you use a neural network and you use some priors, then things don't work well. Yes, I think we have a question.
Yeah, sorry. I think I also got a little hung up on like understanding like the fact that this is static and the I don't know who asked the question about the state space, but just going back to the static phase here, should I just have some understanding of like, okay, we have this underlying prior of the network parameters. And given that we have these observations, which I think of I'm not a Bayesian person, but I think of one of some maybe activations. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
That tells us about what we can infer on the network parameters. Like, is that how I should be reading that statement of the static Bayes? Because, yeah, I just want to make sure I'm
Yeah, no.
understanding.
That's a good question. Hopefully, yeah, let me show you this figure, and hopefully that clarifies it. If not, I'll go back to it. But one way you can think about it is that there exists the best model parameters. That's like the fixed view. We can think of it as there is this magical set of numbers or these magical vectors such that it's going to maximize our predictive performance. And at the very beginning, we don't get to observe it. But from a Bayesian point of view, as we start to get more and more observations, right? So you got theta, you can make one prediction with your features, and you get y, and then you get the true observations, and then you update that theta, and then you make a new prediction. So you can believe that if I were to have a loss curve in RMSE, you would believe that the difference between this y hat and the true y would be like slowly going down through time. Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, so I guess I mean that incorporates sort of the recursive notion of like we're updating what we know about like the optimal network.
Exactly.
Is that
yeah.
fair? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Let me put it another way. If you ever use ridge regression, or a very famous ridge regression, it turns out that because everything's linear there, this way of thinking about recursive Bayes is a way to get the same results as if you do like the batch. You do the x transpose x plus the yada yada inverse. If you do that offline, it would match the Bayesian recursive way. So it's really just a different way to get to the optimal result. Yes, I think Eli, you have a question?
Yeah, so now that we've given up on having normalized probability densities everywhere and we're doing generalized Bayes, what does the Bayesian framework buy us over regularized optimization?
So in this case, no, that's a good question. So we still have a notion of uncertainty. And the second one, well, for this case, you actually get that in some cases, doing this recursive Bayes in a linear model is going to give you a comma filter, and then you can think of a comma filter as a second order optimization. So they're very tightly coupled. So if you want to think about why do I need this in a Bayesian sense, like that's fine. But then the punchline is going to be, once we tackle state space models, we do need some sort of beliefs. We need to propagate those beliefs back to these generalized Bayesians. So yeah, for now, it's fair to question then why do we need this? But I guess it's when we get into the hierarchical state space model where you
hierarchical
start to see...
or with time, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right,
exactly.
thank you.
Great. So hopefully this makes sense now. So we have some sort of prior belief or your initial condition, if you want to be frequentist, and you're updating your posterior densities over time. You're making predictions, and hopefully the loss curve goes down. But okay, so the first thing we need to, so the first thing we saw is that I need some sort of model, right? This can be linear regression, logistic regression, any neural network architecture. The second thing we're going to tackle is how do I make updates on these model parameters. But before we discuss that, we also need to discuss about how to make predictions in a Bayesian way, right? Which is also an advantage of using Bayes, because you can use Thompson sampling, at least if you're doing contextual bandits. So if you have this probabilistic model, P of Y, recall that we have our conditional model H, and we have our data set. Then the classical way to do a prediction is to do this integral over here, right? So we have the value that I want to predict at time t+1 is conditioned on the data, and the features at time x plus c, and I simply need to solve this. But of course, we all know that, as long as you have a neural network, this is highly intractable. So one thing you can do is simply do a map approximation. So we can simply take the posterior density with data points up to time t, and then I take the argmax over that, and then I plug it in here, and that would be my map estimate approximation. So these are two ways to do these Bayesian predictions, which are point estimates. But of course, we're talking about uncertainty, then you can do some sort of posterior sampling. This is common in contextual bandits and Thompson sampling, where you want to draw from the posterior density at time t, and imagine that here the y hat will be the value of the arms that you have. And then, so you sample from that, and you evaluate it here, you have A arms, and you take the arc max over those possible arms, and then, you get your next decision. So that's how we can do one step ahead Bayesian prediction. Another reason why you want to be Bayesian. So now that we have a choice of model, and we need to find the posterior density, right? We haven't really said about how we're going to find this posterior density over time. And ideally, we want to have a recursive way of doing that. So I'm going to present two examples. The first one is the recursive variational Bayes method. And in this case, we say, okay, we don't really get to observe this is intractable. Right? So the prior times the likelihood is intractable. So I cannot solve that at every time step. So I'm just going to assume that every time step, the density that I'm targeting is a Gaussian. And then I want to minimize the scale divergence. It's also related to the Bong paper. And then the idea is to find this mean and to find your mean and your posterior covariance such that minimizes the scale divergence. And in reality, it's a convenience, right? It's not that you really believe that your posteriors are Gaussian. It's just that you only have to work with to fully specify your density. You only need two moments, right? The mean and the covariance. And it turns out that a Gaussian does that, so that's a nice thing to work with. And this is this formulation that I'm running here comes from a paper called the Recursive Variational Gaussian Approximation, the RVGA. And this is one way in which you can approximate your posterior densities at every time step.
So just to clarify, sorry,
yes.
In Bong, it turns out that the entire paper is based on Gaussian approximate posteriors, but in your case, you're not going to limit yourself to Gaussian. Is that correct?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be Gaussian. In the paper, as a framework, you don't have to be Gaussian, but you use Gaussians because you're going to recover very nice approximation methods, right? It's really, they're closely related to this second order, proxy second order optimization methods. So,
okay. Yeah, but the framework itself, unlike Bong, the framework itself allows you to make your own choices. It's not like
exactly.
Okay.
You don't have to use it for prediction if you want to. You don't have to do it for like machine learning prediction. If you are doing some sort of experiment where you truly have some model and you have some really priors about your model that you want to specify there, then that you could use it.
Okay.
But I'll just focus with Gaussians for the
for
rest of the talk. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the first example. The second example that I quite like, just because it's really easy to implement, is to be very cheap and say, well, really, what I want to do is, instead of considering this neural network, what I can do is I can consider a first order approximation around some previous beliefs, right? So if I assume that the density that I'm tracking is a Gaussian with some mean and some covariance, then I can do a first order approximation around the previous mean of the function, and out I get this formula over here, which if you see, it's going to be linear with respect to theta t. And just to make it simple on myself, I'm going to assume that it's Gaussian. It's going to be Gaussian, so I'm gonna take my measurement model, I'm going to replace it with the Gaussian, and I'm going to take this value over here, I'm going to plug it in here, and this RT can either be moment matched. So for instance, if this is a logistic regression, this would be h times 1 minus h, right? Because that will be the variance.
Which h? Capital or small h?
The capital H, yes.
Okay. And what is capital H? It's just a function?
Yeah, sorry. So capital H here, I think I forgot. This is the Jacobian, sorry. So this would be the Jacobian of little h evaluated at mu t minus 1. Sorry, I forgot about that.
Okay. Sounds good.
Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, but the punchline is that at the end of the day, you get an h that is linear with respect to theta. And then you have this measurement model over here. And because your prior is Gaussian and your likelihood is Gaussian, then out comes a likelihood function that is also Gaussian. Yes, I think you have a question.
Yeah, so when is a Gaussian a good enough approximation versus when is it not?
Well, I
Like
think
it's
the
very
question,
nice what you can do with Gaussians, but in my
yeah.
experience, that's often a cover for the fact that lots of problems aren't Gaussian.
I think it really depends on if you're trying to, if you have massive amounts of data and you want to be Bayesian in some way, then I think the best thing you can do is Gaussian. But if you're working with some well-specified data generating process that it's Poisson and you want to have some exponential prior in there, then you should definitely not do this approximation, for instance, right? You might be better off talking about sequential Monte Carlo, Markov chain Monte Carlo, which are different kinds of approximations. If you truly believe that the data generating process that you're using, follows what you believe. But if the only thing that you want is to maximize predictive performance and talk about neural networks, then it's quite hard to say what's a good prior for a neural network. And it just turns out that Gaussian is very convenient. So that's a reason why you should use a Gaussian. Hopefully that answers your question. And yes,
one more
okay.
question.
Yep.
So Christina asks, is this just the extended Kalman filter?
It is actually. We're gonna get to that.
Okay.
It is extended Kalman filter with some caveats because in this case we still don't have an SSM, and because we don't have an SSM, we don't have dynamics, and because we don't have dynamics, we're gonna converge to something, and we're gonna get to see what that's going to be the result of that in a little bit. So answer is yes with an asterisk. So as a simple example, I'm gonna consider this online classification with neural networks. As I said, if I want to build a Bayesian online learning machine, I need two things at least. I need a model, and for the choice of model, I'm going to consider a two-hidden layer neural network. And for my choice of algorithm, I'm going to consider this moment match linear Gaussian approximation, which is exactly an extended Kalman filter asterisk. And this is what the neural network is going to see. Now, in reality, it's only going to see one data point at a time, right? So this is the whole data set. This is the whole set of data points that the neural network is going to see. But I'm just going to show it like one data point at a time, and then I'm going to do these updates through this linear Gaussian approximation, right? So I'm going to take my neural network, I'm going to compute the Jacobian, I'm going to get a linear model, and then I'm going to update, get Gaussian posteriors, and then I'm going to do it over and over and over again. So the choice of model that I pick is this one, right? It's simply going to be an MLP, very simple, two-hidden layer neural network, with ReLUs, and outputs come with sigmoid. And this is the algorithm that I'm going to use. And this starts to look more and more like an extended Kalman filter. And the idea is, okay, now that I have these two components, I have my measurement model, I have my algorithm of choice, I'm going to make these updates. And the question is, how does it look like? So it starts like this, right? So at the very beginning, it doesn't know what to do, but just note that it's really observing each data point one at every time step, right? So I'm not doing any sort of like mini batch optimization, or I'm not doing any like replay buffers or anything like that. It's only one data point. You give me one data point and I throw it away. The only thing that I have at time t are my mean, my posterior covariance, and the only observation that I have. And you can clearly see that, fairly quickly, relatively fairly quickly, being a simple neural network, after 100 samples, you get a very decent accuracy. I think it's around 85 or 90. In around 200 data points, you can clearly see that it's learned to separate the class 1 from class 2. That's great. So
I have a question.
Yes.
How would this compare to just a standard batched regression, logistic regression?
So comparing in what sense? So for classical
in terms of
logistic
accuracy,
regression,
like imagine like you have a horizontal line that shows if you did the standard, not standard, but maybe like the typical.
You can do a feature transformation.
batched.
All of that. We can do some sort of like feature transformation. I don't know, 40 random features, and then do logistic regression.
Yeah.
Then you can do the exact same trick here. Just that now you wouldn't need to compute the Jacobian of the sigmoid function, theta transpose, and all that. But I would presume that for this very simple scenario would behave more or less the same. I think.
Okay.
Great. So all this to say, if you want to build a Bayesian online sequential estimation where you assume that the world doesn't change, so there's no state space model for now, you can get pretty decent as long as the data generating process stays fixed, right? And to test this, I'm going to consider the same setup from the previous experiment. I'm going to consider a neural network, 2-layer neural network, and I'm going to consider this linearized moment matched Gaussian approximation. And I'm going to consider this example from the online continual learning literature, where I'm going to see that for the first 200 data points, we have these two classes, and then after 200 data points, the classes are going to rotate, and then they're going to rotate again and again and again and again. And of course, again, the same problem is how do I estimate yt+1 given the data set and given the observation that I have, right? So xt, the features are going to be the position, the location, yt+1, class 1 or class 2, fairly easy. Now, of course, us as humans, I mean, you guys might know this more than I do, but you can clearly see that there are some boundaries here, right? If I were to have some notion of where these boundaries exist, then clearly, at least I can draw some lines over here, like separating them. But if I only give you the data set like that, like at once, you get this completely different sort of data set, right? So it more or less just highlights the importance of having the separation through time. So now I'm going to take the result that I got previously. I'm going to take this, again, the same model that I have. And then after 200 data points, remember the data generative process is changing. And then you see that the neural network starts to learn everything. At the very end, it's just complete nonsense, right? So this is what people call the so-called lack of plasticity, right? So it doesn't want to forget, right? It's like it wants to adhere so much to the past that, doesn't know how to fit what's best and what's worst. Anyway, so the accuracy decays. It not only decays for the last regime, but for all the regimes, right? So the decision boundaries, complete nonsense after 1,000 samples.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how do we fix this, right? And the one other question would be, well, is being Bayesian and not enough for adaptivity? And there's this very famous paper, very good paper, Variational Online Continuous Learning. And in a way, what they argue is that it's really not that being Bayesian is all that you need to adapt, right? And in a way, what they argue is that the only thing that it's not allowing you to adapt to the non-stationarity of the data is that you don't compute the posterior density well enough, right? It's because we're doing these approximations that the performance of the model decays, but really what's at the core of adaptation is this Bayesian, the Bayes rule, sorry. But what we argue is that really, if you want to be Bayesian, all you need, you can separate these two things, right? I have a way to update my model parameters. I can keep that fixed, and I can have my model. I can keep that fixed, and then I can only talk about how the world changes, and that's where we start to get into this hierarchical state space model that I show, because having your model and how you want to update the model parameters, you need some more things to start thinking about changes in the data generating process, at least in a time ordered manner. And to do that, we're going to need 3 more things. And the first one is we're going to need an auxiliary variable. And this auxiliary variable tells us what do we mean that by the world is changing, right? Like what does that mean? How do I encode it? The second additional component we're going to need is a way to get this auxiliary variable that tells us our beliefs on how the data generating process is changing and put it inside our prior. And the third one is we're going to compute a posterior over the auxiliary variable, right? So we're splitting 2 things now. We have this, at least for the case of machine learning, these highly complex posterior over model parameters that I cannot reason over, but perhaps I can reason about how the world is changing. I don't know if it's working something like finance. Perhaps you can think that it crashes and then like slowly rebumps over time. If it's user retention, you can think that, people slowly start to dislike things. Anyways, you can encode those beliefs into a separate thing from the model that you choose and how you want to update those model parameters.
So in M3, when you say the effect of the auxiliary variable on the prior, you mean the prior on theta, right? The model parameters?
Exactly. Yeah. I'll get to that in a little bit. So now I'm going to talk about the auxiliary variable. And this is what do you mean by a regime, right? Because we haven't, we can talk about regimes all we want, but we haven't really specified like mathematically what we mean by a regime. And this is where we start seeing a bunch of instances in the literature of what different people and researchers mean by mean by regime. The first one, and this is very classical in the change point detection literature, is this run length. And you can say, well, whatever tracks non-stationarity is the last time step since the last change point. The way I like to think about this, like a look back adaptive window, right? So one thing you can do in machine learning is have like these replay buffers, right? You fixed how I want to consider the last 500 observations, and the last 100 observations, 500 observations, and then I'm just going to roll that forward over time, right? But if I have
can I interrupt you? Sorry, I just wanted to ask
yes.
you, I don't know, maybe you're going to get to this at some point, but can you actually define what is an auxiliary variable? Is it just some latent variable, or what is the definition of it? Do you think it's useful to define it first so we can actually just have an expectation of what that does and that means?
So we can put it as the so if you think of logistic regression, right, then you have a prior on your model parameters, and if you believe something about the model that you're modeling, if you believe something about the prior that you're using, then you can induce something about the likelihood. If that makes sense, then you can also think about this auxiliary variable as another prior that you're going to have on some other model. But now it's not going to be a model over neural networks. Now it's going to be a model over how things are changing over time.
So like you just segment the how the prior itself evolves according to different dynamics, let's say, or different rules in different segments.
Exactly. So imagine so the auxiliary variable is really just a way to encode mathematically what you mean by a regime. So in this example, what I mean by a regime, like in words, is that whenever the world changes, it resets. It never happens again. And so in that case, all I need to keep track of is the time since the last change point. Now, that doesn't have to be how you want to mold a regime, but that could be one way to do it.
Okay, so it seems like thinking about auxiliary variables and regimes interchangeably, like I think that's what I'm hearing. Like it seems like you're suggesting auxiliary variables should be discrete, if you put it that way.
Well, not necessarily, right? Because that's the thing. You can assume that the world or that the regimes are slowly drifting through time. So in that case, you may not want to have an auxiliary variable that is discrete. And I'm going to see an example of that in a few slides.
Okay. All right. I'll let you continue. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. So hopefully this slide clarifies it. Okay. So yeah, I mean, for this auxiliary variable is just what I mean by a regime. If you assume that it's discrete, if you assume that the world changes in a discrete and abrupt sense, then you can use this run length auxiliary variable, where, for instance, here, whenever you see these orange boxes, means that a change point occurred. So this auxiliary variable should increase by 1 at every time step, and it should reset to 0 whenever you see a change point. In fact, if you ever heard about the Bayesian online change point detection paper, this is exactly the auxiliary variable that they use. But you might say, okay, but really, if you use this run length, an important component is this so-called hazard rate, which is not only whether a change point occurred or didn't occur, but how frequent are the change points. So if you want to encode that mathematically, then you can consider a different auxiliary variable. You might not only want to encode how many time steps since the last change point or your lookback window, but also how many change points you've seen so far. And that should give you a sense of the probability of a change point, in the sense that, whenever there's a change point here, you have 2 change points, but the change point just occurs. So really your hazard rate is however many time steps, well, 7 divided by 2. And so forth.
Having like an auxiliary variable of like a phase angle that on the unit circle, basically, could generate the same like cyclostationary processes they use in financial modeling, where it's like, oh, this is this season's trend. So the dynamic is basically repeating over a different time scale than the actual
different angular velocity or something.
Or it's like there's a dynamic, and the dynamic is making a loop in the space of like transfer functions, for example.
I don't know if you heard that
No,
Jerry.
if you repeat the question, please.
I don't know if it was a question or maybe it was a comment that you can actually
It wasn't
just
a comment.
think of this
Okay.
as like a phase rotating on like some space, angular space. Yeah.
The cyclostationary processes are well studied in
Mhm.
the speech detection.
Mhm.
So if you do the, yeah, it's just one like.
Just another good example. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. I mean, if that's an example, yeah. So yeah, it's just how you encode regimes, really. But so we have the run length, we have the run length with change point count. You can be even more aggressive and say, I not only do I want to know how many change points and have occurred, but the time steps since the last change point. I want to have like full information about the change points that I assume that are not changing over time. So we can have an auxiliary variable that in this case, instead of increasing by 1 on this tuple, it's increasing exponentially, right? So in this case, you're really encoding all that you can about a change point, right? So when change points occurred, so the location, how many, and the and when was the last time for the current observation. But alternatively, you can believe that the regimes repeat themselves, so you can encode that information, right? Because this assumes that whenever a change point occurred, there's, you only care about the information that's in between two change points. You can assume that you really care about all the information that you can get and that regimes could repeat. So you can have this alternative viewpoint of a change point location where you have this set of vectors that increase by 1 whenever it's 1 whenever the data points belong to the current regime, right? So you can have, for instance, instead of at 7, imagine that at this time step, the first 3 data points belong to this regime, you believe. So you would have here a 1, 1, 1, then a bunch of zeros, then 1, right? So there's a different way to encode regimes. So these are all discrete, but you can also have, I think as we discussed previously, you can have something that is continuous, right? Perhaps I want to model not the whether a change point occurred, didn't occur, but something more continuous, like the change point probability. Perhaps you want to allocate some dynamical model of the probability of a change point. Well, you can do that. You can find that in literature as well. Another example would be the mixture of experts approach. And this is common in, for instance, the hidden Markov models, where you assume that you already have a fixed set of regimes and you can transition back to different regimes. And finally, a different auxiliary variable is just a constant, right? You can assume that the world is always changing regardless of whatever actions you take or how you're updating your beliefs. This goes back to the extended gamma filter example, which I'll talk in a little bit. But anyways, so you can go to the literature, you can read all these papers, and if it comes from the machine learning literature, statistics literature, signal processing literature, they really all have this concept of auxiliary variable, even implicitly or explicitly. They have this parameter here that affects, they're gonna affect their posterior in some way. And this is a small table of the possible auxiliary variables that you can keep. Now you can imagine that one, you can say, well, this auxiliary variable is going to help me more than others. But at the end of the day, what we're going to see algorithmically is that sometimes it becomes computationally infeasible to work with some of these. For instance, the run length is linear in time. What it means is that at time t, you have to compute t possible things. So you can imagine you have like a summation over t things. Whereas if you go for this CPL, change point location, which you assume that it's either 0 and 1, so you have a 2 to the power of t possible summations that you have to do, right? So you play a game of, do I want something that is very nice algorithmically, or something that is captures much of the information, but I have to go back to the approximation posterior, which is going to be another choice of algorithm. But this is just a modeling choice, right? What do you mean by a regime? Is it changing abruptly? Is it slowly? Is it changing smoothly over time? Any questions on this? If not, then okay. So now we have whatever we mean by a regime or this auxiliary variable. The next modeling choice is going to be this conditional prior, which is, how do I modify my beliefs given this auxiliary variable? So typically, if you think about Bayes, right, it's like the prior is given, and then the only thing you really can work with is the likelihood, right? That's the main tool that people usually reason about this. But you can think about it in a different way, right? We can also modify the prior before a new observation comes in. If we believe that the world has changed somehow, and we encode it in this auxiliary variable phi, then we can not only think about the likelihood that we're considering, but also how do we modify our prior beliefs before I get to observe any new information. And this idea of modulating the prior before a new data point comes in, goes back to this paper in 1993, which they call this idea of conditioning this prior as this forgetting operator. Because at the end of the day, if you want to adapt to some regime, it turns out that you're going to have to forget. You have to forget in the sense that you have a big data set, and you have to choose what you want to consider for that data set in order to make posterior inference over your model parameters. So with that, we have now the choice of measurement function, or your M1. We already have our auxiliary variable, which is going to be our choice M2. We have our algorithmic choice, which is going to be how you compute the posterior. And now we have this different modeling choice, which is how do I modify the prior given that I have this auxiliary variable. So the question is, okay.
I have a question. So if you marginalize over psi t, do you recover the actual prior? How do you get prior from pi?
How do you get the prior?
So I'm just asking, if I want a prior at time t for theta sub t, can I just marginalize over pi, integrate over all psi t, and then get to the prior? Is that how you think about this?
So no, so okay, yeah, that's a good question. So you know how you think about, okay, do you believe that this is like a loss function or a likelihood? It's something that is given to you, right? So I have a neural network and I want to make it Gaussian because it's very convenient, and that's it, right? It's given to me. So that's an algorithmic choice. It's something that I can code. I can do the exact same thing for the prior. That's the idea. I can tell you algorithmically how am I going to modify this prior algorithmically so that I can put these two together and then out comes a posterior density. I can give you a few examples on that. And that's the next slide. So hopefully that clarifies it. So I'm going to keep for Gaussians just because it's simple. But we're going to think of this prior now as being some function of the auxiliary variable phi and the past data. If you look at it, the prior is going to be conditioned on the previous data sets that we've seen, which makes sense, and the auxiliary variable at time t. And then this conditional prior is going to give you a Gaussian with some mean and some covariance that you're going to modulate somehow. Let's start with a simple example. If you assume that the auxiliary variable is constant and you do not want to modify your prior, then you simply set this function for the mean and the covariance, the previous mean and the prior covariance, right? So there's a trivial extension of, we recovered the classical base where I believe that the prior that I have at time t shouldn't be modified, right? I believe that the world hasn't changed, so I'm not going to modify it. But if you assume that it did change, right, then I'm going to modify my prior mean and prior covariance in this way. So remember, so in this case, I'm going to consider the auxiliary variable to be the run length. Remember, this is the value that increases by 1 at every time step. So it's either greater than 0 or it's 0. If it's 0, it means that there's a change point. So the question is, okay, how do I want to modify my prior beliefs given that a change point just happened? Well, if I don't have any information about what just happened, then perhaps I want to fall back to some prior mean and some prior covariance. I can do that, right? But if not, I'm simply going to consider the mean and the covariance that I get by considering the last RT minus 1 data points, right? Because RT is greater than 0, so this at least has to be 1. So this is one way in which you can construct this mean and covariance. Now, algorithmically, why this is useful? It's useful because you may not want to reset your prior mean. In the case of neural networks, you may not want to forget everything that you've learned, but perhaps you want to modify your weights. So you can, for instance, have a mixture where you always consider the prior mean, but the covariance is only going to be inflated or deflated, right? So that's one way in which you can think about it. And that's the example that...
There's a question.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't... Is it in the chat?
Yeah.
No.
No. Can you hear me?
Oh. Yes, I can.
Cool.
Barely.
Yeah, okay. Explain to me. So I'm still trying to wrap my head around this formulation of the auxiliary variable compared to kind of more conventional approaches, if it were the unsupervised setting, you would introduce like latent variable and have, say, a partially observed Markov decision process or something
Yep.
to
Yep.
capture the changing dynamics in the world, right? And you would have fixed parameters of your model of the world, but the state space would change. Here you're saying, give me a different neural network for different regimes. And so I have these auxiliary variables, which are my evolving prior over the network parameters. And I'm wondering how to, like, do these two things come together, or is there a reason to formulate it this way, where I'm basically, because you can imagine that theta becomes really, really high dimensional for large neural networks. And so rather than having a fixed theta and a dynamic state space, yeah, basically I'm having trouble reconciling these two perspectives here, and I'm wondering if you have an opinion.
So just to make sure, so the two perspectives we're trying to reconcile is the fact that you have the auxiliary variable and the fact that you have in some parameters of the neural network.
Well, so the auxiliary variable is governing like how you are updating your parameters of the neural network, right? Which could be very high dimensional. Right?
How you're updating your beliefs over the
Parameters,
parameters.
those
Yeah.
parameters, right? But at a given moment, I have a network that is going to be my whatever my original H function was that does that generates the likelihood or the observation, given the data that I have.
So hopefully this answered the question. If not, please correct me. But I think that you can think of these auxiliary variables in just how am I updating what data do I use to update the neural network parameters? Hopefully that's one way to put it. So you can think of the auxiliary variable as something else outside of the neural network, right? So the neural network is there. You have your fixed set of parameters. That's fine. In fact, I'm considering those fixed set of parameters as these mu values over here, and some which have some covariance, whatever. We don't need to care about that. And then all I'm saying is with this auxiliary variable, you can decide how much information you want to put into the neural network or how much data you want to consider in the neural network. Now, for the specific case of the neural network, perhaps this makes sense more in the last layer setting. Perhaps you can say, well, I don't want to modify all the parameters of the neural network. Perhaps you just want to modify the last layer of the neural network if I want to do like some sort of fine tuning. So in that sense,
can I try to offer a perspective that I think I understand what Jake is coming from. So imagine you have a state space model, like a switching linear dynamical system, SLDS.
Yeah.
And you have this auxiliary variable, like the categorical from which you sample, and it gives you a linear dynamical system A that helps you evolve the system. In that particular case, that auxiliary variable tells you how dynamics unfolds in your state space. And I don't really see it's fundamentally different here. It's just the dynamics over the parameters of them.
This is basically like from the brain perspective.
Yeah.
This is saying I'm going to dramatically change all of my synapses all of a sudden.
Yeah, which neuromodulation does sometimes, right?
No, it changes the way the dynamics run.
Okay.
Right? So like
no, I think neuromodulation actually like literally changes synapses sometimes.
Not on the time scale. Well, I mean,
we don't want to get into that,
right,
but
yeah, it's not like an erase function.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but this is an example. He's just giving us an example of how this auxiliary variable can be used.
Oh, wait. I mean, I'm not saying that you have to forget. I mean, in the case where you have like multiple regimes, in the case for the neural network example, which they don't have like any specific dynamics, you really just set up convenience. If you have like K regimes, then you would have K copies of your neural network, if that makes sense, right? So you jump into a new regime, and then you're in regime 1. I'm going to update with the information that I have in regime 1. Oh, I jump to regime 4. Then I'll update with the information that I only get from regime 4. But algorithmically, what that means is you're going to have 4 copies of your neural network, right? In this case, you would have T copies of your neural network, right? And you can have 1 copy depending on what you want. But yeah, we don't have to erase information, which if that's the concern.
Okay, so then maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but is this kind of basically separating like the sort of uncertainty over the model and uncertainty over the data, right? Like the state space model.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. So it's like you can think of the base rule on the model parameters as this fancy machine to do updates, right? You can even replace the choice of algorithmic one for SGD. That's fine. And then once you fix that, it's okay. We can reason about uncertainty of some higher level structures depending on the structure of your data. which is similar to do if you have these auxiliary variables. And yeah, but then the question is, okay, how do I modify the mean that I found through SGD? Well, these are some examples that I'm presenting here. Hopefully that clarifies the question.
And I think,
R, in this case, is it something that you estimate or something that you specify?
is
So
R
R in this case
something-
it's a latent variable. It's a latent variable. So you would have a time t in the worst case, because there are ways to make it more efficient. But because of latent variable, you have to marginalize over this. So you would need to consider t possible means and t possible covariance, one for each value. And then you perform Bayesian inference, or you can do your Viterbi algorithm if you want, and you could just compute the map estimate.
Sorry, I still don't get it. Another way to ask is that, do you know what's the relevance in this case? Did you assume?
But can you repeat the question?
Do you know what is the run length in this case, or do you assume it? Do you infer it? Do you know
Okay, so right now I haven't talked about what's the posterior over this latent variable, right? So that's going to be the final piece of the puzzle, which is, it's you can do all these sort of things, but the question is, how do I pick the best one? And the best one is going to be, well, that depends on what's the posterior over this latent variable that you get, which is going to be your final algorithmic choice.
Sounds good. Which maybe I guess we want to let you finish, so maybe let's go ahead and talk about the final piece.
Yeah. Sorry. How much time do I have left? Or
I mean, officially we have 30 more minutes left. We don't want to keep people after that, but of course, you can take as long as you want.
Okay. Let me try to wrap this up then. Okay. I'm gonna try to run to one more example that doesn't forget. And in this case, you assume that the data generating process, when it changes not abruptly, but drifts through time. So you can consider these sort of changes for the mean and the covariance, where you drift, or you have this OU process between the prior mean and some pre-specified mean covariance that you can choose. So you can have another things, right? If you believe this, back to the hidden Markov model case, or this infinite hidden Markov model case would be in this case. If you believe that the world repeats itself, then you can consider the mean and the covariance that belong to the regime that you've seen at time t, and all the data points that you've encountered that belong to the current regime. And the most simple one is this constant with additive covariance inflation. This is common in, for instance, linear state space models and any Kalman filter, where in this case, you do keep your previous mean and you add some covariance noise here, just so that your neural networks don't converge, and then you can always have some sort of uncertainty or dynamics in the model parameters. Now, if you're talking about neural networks, what is convenient to do is just set this as an isotropic covariance matrix with some alpha greater than 0. Okay, so if we put all that together, then a prediction conditioned on some auxiliary variable, and I haven't said how do you want to estimate this, but imagine that you would need to compute this for every single possible auxiliary variable that you have, right? So if it's the hidden Markov model case, then you would have as many predictions as number of regimes that you have. But then we want to weight these sort of predictions conditioned on this auxiliary variable. And that leads us to the final bit of the puzzle, which is, how do I find a posterior over this latent variable, which is all about the data generating process that I'm trying to estimate. And if you assume, again, a hidden Markov model, then we can perform this decomposition over here, in which you can see in various papers. But the idea is that if you assume that it's Markovian, I mean, you assume that the probability of you have some dynamics for the new auxiliary variable given the past, then you get to this recursive way, and then out comes your algorithm. So this is one way to compute the posterior. Now, we're not talking about the posterior over model parameters, right? You compute that for every possible auxiliary variable. Now we're talking about a different posterior. And that's a reason why being Bayesian would make sense in this case, because we're talking about posteriors over this auxiliary variable, which we can more or less measure depending on the predictions that we're doing. A different approach would be to simply take a loss based loss function for instance, in this case, where I can have like different weights. And instead of having a Bayesian approach, I can simply assign more weights to the predictions that have less error. And another common one is to have an empirical Bayes approach, where I'm going to simply say that the posterior is going to be a map estimate on this empirical Bayes posterior predictive. So if you put all that together, then we get to the Bone framework, which is, to recap, the model that you have, that could be your neural network. You also need an auxiliary variable for regime changes. That's going to be your phi. We need a conditional model for prior beliefs. That is, how do you modulate the past data condition on this auxiliary variable? And then you need two algorithmic choices, one posterior for the model parameters and another posterior for the auxiliary variables condition on the data. And so finally, if you wanted to make a prediction using this machinery, what you would need to do is, well, first, this is the prediction that we saw before, right? So we have this thing, and you can take the map estimate if you want to, that's fine. But this is conditioned on your auxiliary variable. And then you're going to have as many auxiliary variables as big is this set here, which is all the possible values of your auxiliary variables. And then, yeah, that would be your final prediction that you would do. And then it turns out that many methods in the literature do recover this sort of prediction model, even if they're not doing prediction. So I'm going to show a very quick example, and then I can wrap this up. So I'm gonna go back to the non-stationary moons example. That's the one where they're rotating, and I'm going to consider three examples. One example is from the change point detection / statistics literature, which is going to consider the run length with prior reset, also known as the BOCD algorithm, if that makes sense to you. I'm going to consider one algorithm from the machine learning literature, which is going to be this. I'm going to assume that the world changes slowly through time, and I'm going to model it instead of resetting the model parameters. I want to consider this OU forgetting factor. And I'm going to consider a very simple baseline in which I assume that the world is changing at every time step. And I'm just going to inject a little bit of uncertainty at every time step. So if I were to do the first one, this is how it looks like. So this is the, so again, the choice of model that has the same neural network. And again, this is the value of your run length, or this is the value of the auxiliary variable, which you're modeling. And the only thing that I'm doing is I'm considering two things at every time step. I'm either evaluating whether the run length is greater than 0 or is 0. If it's 0, I reset the model parameters, and you can see that here, right? So that's where it resets. And if it's greater than 0, I only update the run length, right? So this is a very greedy example so that they can all be comparable. So I only keep one copy of the neural network. Well, two. Want the current one and the one that I have for backup. That would be like my initial weights if I wanted to. And we can see that at least for this example, right? Whenever there's a change point, you can, it resets. And of course, you can assume that you can have a different auxiliary variable, which goes back to previous regimes. That could be another way to model it. So that's the example from the statistics literature. We can have this other example.
Sorry, the red curve there, is that the ground truth or is that your inferred value?
So yeah, so this is the inferred value.
Oh,
so
okay.
Yeah, exactly. So at every time step, right? So this latent variable, like I cannot make sense of the posterior over neural network parameters, but at least I can make sense of this run length over here. And at every time step, I am updating RT. I take RT, I added one, and I compare two things. Is it more likely that the run length is RT minus 1 plus 1, or is it more likely that it's 0? And I keep the one that is most likely by affecting my priors, and this is what I get at the very end.
Nice.
I guess it's see what's going on here at the fine time scale, but how many new data points in the new model does it have to see before it decides to change? It looks like it changes instantaneously. Like I just give you one new data point, and all of a sudden it says, okay, new model. I mean, if we zoomed in on that little transition point, would we see it's taking some time to reset?
So the question is, what is the time scale of resetting? Is it like if you zoom in, is that instantaneous, or does it take a few iterations to reset?
So in this case, it's instantaneous, but it doesn't. In this particular case, it depends on your likelihood more, or your loss function. So at least for this particular example, and there's actually a paper by some co-authors from UCL that propose this robustified BOCD, because the advantage or drawback of these methods, there are two ways to look at it, is that it's very reactive. As long as you have a likelihood that doesn't conform with what you've seen before, it resets. So you may want to avoid having to reset if you have something like outliers, for instance.
Exactly. It seems like it'd be very brittle then. In that case.
I mean, that's a big problem with the Tolman filters in general.
Yeah, we do have an example where we actually robustify this when you have outliers. And we're actually working on a paper where we actually quantified, because you're going to have to make a decision, right? So it becomes a decision-making problem, at least for this auxiliary variable, in that how many times you want to be wrong before you say that the world really has changed, right? So it becomes a problem of, there's not going to be a solution. There's going to be a threshold of possible solutions that you can choose from.
Yeah,
Nice.
like in robotics, they have all these ad hoc Tolman filters with like these weird truncated Gaussians and things where they're like, they just start ignoring things and assume that it's a noisy sample. Because you get sensors. Which sometimes.
So was there a question?
No, just a comment about robotics and Kalman filters.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with robotics, but yeah, I'm happy to hear it though. And okay, so let me jump to another example. This is from a paper by Tizias and others in 2023. This was proposed for online continuing learning classification. And in this case, you assume that the world changes with some probability. So you're not modeling really the whether a change point didn't occur. You're just simply modeling the probability of a change point. And what you see over here is that whenever there's a change point, you would like this probability to decay so that the neural network forgets, right? It's going to reset back to some prior beliefs. But of course, one problem from this method is that it can be quite easy to detect a new change point, but then the problem is that depending on the learning rate that you choose, because this continues, you don't want to solve these massive intervals, you know, do a point estimate, you're going to have to do some inner iterations. And depending on how you choose the learning rate, this can take quite a few time steps before it really picks back up. And so the third example, and this is a very surprisingly very robust example, is just to inject noise at every time step. Now, this is not the best for sequential decision making, but it's great if you only care about like point estimate predictive performance, which is just take your posterior covariance, just add some noise, and then you can see here that, you know, as soon as the data generating process changes, it does get to adapt. Now, the big drawback is that because their Q here is really a rate of forgetting, so if it's not well calibrated, you get these things over here where you still see some traits of the past that you may want to forget or not, depending on your problem. And finally, well, we can create a new method, and this is the RLOUPR. And this is just an example of the things that you can do. It turns out that the run length is quite a nice auxiliary variable, even if it's just a thing. Here it's just like increases by 1 or resets to 0. But perhaps if you're talking about a neural network, you don't want to reset your model parameters, right? Maybe if they're massive, you don't want to go back to the very beginning. So you can do a trade-off. You can reset your model parameters if you have the posterior over the run length is greater than some value epsilon, and you're going to reset it otherwise. So this is going to have the effect of I'm going to slowly forget only, and I'm going to reset only if necessary. And this is how it looks like. So in this case, you can see here the probability of a change point. And so that it can forget, but it doesn't forget all the way to the beginning, just sometimes, just here, for instance. But here it's just a little bit of a reset, not too much, just enough to adapt to the new data generating process. And yep. So this is the comparison, at least for these methods. And if you go back to the literature, and then you're very picky about trying to find these auxiliary variables, you get this very nice table over here. Actually had lots of fun doing this one over here. Even Kevin, my supervisor, was like, "Stop it! We need to submit this paper." But to me, this is very dear to my heart.
Enough with
Yes,
knowledge.
okay.
Time for action.
I'll
The paper, yeah.
I'll skip the rest of experiments, but you can go to the paper and see all the experiments that we did there. But in conclusion, we introduced a framework for Bayesian learning in non-stationary environments, which has 3 modeling choices and 2 algorithmic choices. I think the main thing is that we can separate the model parameters and how we update model parameters from how we believe that the data generating process changes. It doesn't have to be all variational. It doesn't have to be all linear Gaussian. We can mix and match however we want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for presenting. So I just have a question about this round length, which seems like a very simple thing to condition on, and it works surprisingly well. And it reminded, maybe this is totally unrelated, but I think it reminded me of this work from Apo Hivernen in identifiability of ICAs. If you condition that on just the time index of the experiment, it actually leads to some guaranteed identifiability results, even in the case of nonlinear ICA. Do you think this is related to that, or is it just a coincidence?
No, that's very interesting. I'm not aware of that paper. If you can send it to me, that would be
sure. Yeah, I'll find
awesome.
it and put it
But
on
yes,
slide.
yes, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is surprising because, for instance, if you read the papers that follow BOCD, at least from the statistics literature, they always start with the premise that, what do you need round lengths, right? Like the most simple thing you can do. But it turns out that computationally it behaves quite well. Like in the worst case scenario, it just increases linearly in time. And really to set this hazard rate, it's not that sensitive to, because you have to specify what's the probability of a change point. It's really not that sensitive to that. We have some robustness checks on that in the paper. But yeah, it's also surprising to us.
Oh yeah.
Maybe we can look at the chat because I think there's quite a few questions there that we missed. So if you could answer some of them, that would be probably good.
Let's see if I can make this bigger. Okay, one question. Do people ever use sampling, particle filtering, instead of map for dealing with the auxiliary variables?
Definitely. In both, you can do it in both the parameter space, like in the H function, and as well for the auxiliary variable, right? You don't have to do these summations. You can sample from both of them. In fact, so Kevin wrote this paper on the raw Black-Light particle filter, which is in a way related to the Bone method, and they do propose this sampling scheme, where, for instance, you can have the Kalman filter, where you have these vehicles that are like moving, it's moving in this way and then it changes this way. And I think they propose sampling from the auxiliary variable space. And then you can evaluate explicitly the posterior model parameters. At least, well, I kept it just, I didn't consider sampling schemes for this method just because it was tackled for the ML community. Which they all care about, like scalability, and they all say, well, if I want to do sampling, I can do more compute cycles training my neural network. So, but yeah, you can definitely do that.
It seems interesting, the idea of the auxiliary variable being connected to the injected noise into the covariance. Have you guys explored kind of like being able to scale the covariance inflation or infer the inflated covariance?
Could you repeat the question, Hadi? Sorry.
Maybe like a little louder.
Oh yeah, sorry. So I'm asking about basically covariance inflation and how you would go about using an auxiliary variable to infer the degree to which you should inflate your covariance.
Oh yes, there's this paper, I think it's called Shrink and Perturb. I think it was a DERBS, and they do have this idea of by how much do you shrink it or how much you increase it. I don't think they consider the fully online setting, but yeah, the rate of forgetting is it's work in progress. We're actually writing a paper on that, and because it works surprisingly well, and you may not want to, you don't want to attack your, at least for your networks, you don't want to deal with you don't want to modify your mean on the model parameters because you've learned so much that it's not the best thing to forget back to some previous initial estimate. So yeah, it is work in progress that we're doing. Now there are there are a bunch of papers in the signal processing literature. I think if I go to the table, I know that, for instance, these three papers, they all consider different ways to adapt to this dynamics covariance inflation. And in fact, the reason that they do that in at least for the signal processing is that they even say, our model is misspecified, so it turns out that just increasing your doing covariance inflation helps. But that at least is for the signal processing literature.
Yeah, I know that this is common for the kind of like Bayesian I guess optimization problems. So you can typically they use the inflation as like a simulated annealing variable, so that you basically schedule for how you're going to be decreasing your noise, and it helps a lot with some convergence problems that can come up if there's like degeneracies.
No, that'd be great too. If you could send me those references, that'd be great. From a non-Bayesian perspective, that's interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of work in basically all of this as optimization, just directly on either batched or unbatched.
I see.
Any more questions, comments? There was some more in the chat. I don't know, Marta, if you're here and you would just like to unmute yourself and tell us about this comment, or maybe I can just read it out. Okay, it's about the brain stuff, which is always difficult and speculation mostly.
I'm here also.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. Yeah, I found it the paper very well explained. I'm actually very excited about what you started drawing the parallels to the brain. I only always want to be super cautious how much we say, oh, its brain works that or that other way, because that depends very much on definition. What does it mean to understand the brain? On what level? Do you want to have a cellular level understanding or cognitive level understanding, right? So here I would be always very cautious, especially that in experimental neuroscience, you could say that we are only learning single examples of how the brain works in particular situations, not really how the brain works in general. And here we have the problem of an algorithm, I think very practical one actually. And I just have this idea that it would be super cool to, take that model and probably build entire grant, trying to teach mice to play a game and then change the rules on the game on the go, right? So you have perfect control on your auxiliary variable model, right? And how it is changing. And you could actually start reasoning about what the mouse brain does in that game. And yeah, that would be super cool. So, would be happy to actually maybe discuss this with someone on the other occasion.
Yeah. I mean, I fully agree with the idea that, what the brain does is very difficult, and we don't know, and we're probably not going to know for a long time. But you can actually just design experiments where you induce non-stationarity in your experiments and see how the actual real brains react to that non-stationarity. And then maybe that could actually give us hints how to make those choices, M1 to M3 and A1, A2. Like, those choices are open. You can draw inspiration from anything, anywhere to make those choices when you're designing a new model within Bone. And maybe we could use the brain for that inspiration. So totally, I think that's a very exciting direction.
Yeah, and the funny thing is that, from, every experimentalist who try to train mice will tell you, like, we'll immediately see that, the time is important there, and that actually mice are very bad at figuring out the change of the rules in comparison to humans. And so that's, I think that just, this could be entire lab investigating, the time importance on change. And what you said, you have this term of plasticity scramble or something like that. I never heard it actually. It's very interesting, but it was like, yeah, like I could totally see that this something similar could happen in the mouse, and it would be then very interesting actually what happens on the cellular level.
Agreed.
That's
Might
very
probably
interesting.
have.
I don't know much about the literature, but I think one idea that came to mind is that, you have these mice, can you infer which auxiliary variable to use rather than
Yeah, well, thanks, guys. That's great.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks again, Jerry.
All right.
This was great. Thank you so much.
See you
Thank you
next
so
time.
much.
I gotta head to another meeting now.
All right, let's thank the speaker again, and we're gonna stop recording after that.